of some of the liability concerns and the privacy concerns around accessing identities. I think that strategy is a good step in the right direction for anonymizing a lot of people. What it does say, but not very clearly, is who those identity providers will be. They seem to indicate that it will be a partnership between the federal government and private companies. My experience has been that, from a risk perspective at least, it's much easier for a company to outsource the account provisioning, let's say, and we'll talk a little bit further about vendor relationships, simply from a cost and a security perspective. What we wanted to do was really try to engage everyone who's coding applications and who's accessing any kind of identity information to become more involved with the security ecosystem project, and to try to get vendors to understand the problem and also give feedback to the federal government before a standard is put forth. I've heard a lot of comments throughout the conference about, and you see them in the news, the internet is dead, or the internet's collapsing. Companies are being swallowed. There's this great white shark that's swallowing all of these companies, and there's fewer choices out there. We have to really be cognizant of that identity problem because it does have a lot of legal implications.
Okay. Richard, while you have the mic, can we get into some technical details perhaps about supply chain? How are companies managing identity across or down the whole supply chain?
Sure. One of the largest issue that we have from my own experience is that managing tens of thousands of accounts and being able to do that in real time with real data and accurate data is very costly. And if you want to provision access to your internal systems by your external partners, then you can't do that. You can't do that alone. There are people out there, there are providers out there who specialize in account management. You've got to build those relationships and then build your extranets accordingly. Stand up that infrastructure to support the provisioning to your internal applications. We all know that once an identity is compromised, that in fact could turn over the keys to the kingdom to your internal network, or leverage some sort of threat tree to escalate privileges into your other more highly classified systems.
Let's give Mano a turn. You want to talk about best practices?
Actually, I'm going to follow up a little bit on this, but before I do that, Jeff earlier made a comment saying we're not that smart. He was talking about himself. I'm the one wearing the tie here, so. No, talking about best practices, talking about technical stuff, and in terms of identity management as it intersects with application security, we could start with password-based management, the weakest form that you could have, right? So, with regard to IDM as such, within the AppSec space, within where we kind of live and breathe in terms of software, there are 4 things that I think we should keep in mind, and kind of remember, you need to get paid, PAID. So P for like provisioning of identities, A for auditing, I for impersonation and delegation, and then D for deprovisioning of identities. So when we talk about provisioning of identities, if we use like software with password-based management, then make sure you hash it as opposed to encrypt it. So it's a one-way irreversible function, right? When you talk about password-based management, also look at one-time pads, if that's an option for you to be able to manage that as part of your infrastructure, as part of that ecosystem itself. The other part, if you're using certificate-based authentication and identification, then ACL's on the CA root certificate authority, so you don't have spoof certificates and things like that. When we talk about multi-factor, then depending on the business scope itself, you want to think about whether you're going to use a soft token or a hard token. If it's highly sensitive information, then it's hard token is where you want to go, but it's hardware-based as opposed to just a software-generated token. So the provisioning part of it itself has got many technical aspects to it. Then we talk about A as in the auditing part of it, where as part of that whole identity, whether it's a subject as a user or a process, you need to be able to track the user's activity. So auditing becomes critically important, so you can have that forensic evidence, or you could have just being able to get a historical transaction list of what somebody did, when, where, and how did they do it, right? So auditing becomes important. When we're talking about impersonation and delegation, then at certain situations, you may have the need to architect impersonation within your systems. Customer support is a very important, it's a classic use case. I need to be able to see what the customer sees, so you may have to impersonate that customer. But when you do anything like that within the software world, one of the best practices is for you to revert impersonation context almost immediately. So it's done on a very specific explicit case, as opposed to just giving that ability to have a maintenance hook for somebody to be able to just always impersonate, in which case you give room for backdoors. But the last part is often ignored, which is the deprovisioning of identities. Our application should be architected so that when somebody leaves that software scope, then you have a main means to be able to deprovision. So if I was to ask a question to the audience, how many of you have had a situation where you had somebody leave a team, or they left the company, they came back and joined the company, or they came back and joined the team? You're still going to see that they have that identity as part of that, right? And you have to give them username 1 or some other attribute to be able to define them from what they were, but they're the same person. But if they log in with the previous account credentials, then they have authorizations creep as part of that, what rights they had already as part. So we've got to become intelligent in terms of architecting software to take into account identity management issues, from provisioning to deprovisioning, taking into account auditing and impersonation as well. You're not going to say that I'm not smart, right?
I'll see you after the show. Actually, so I just wanted to add one thing. I think that's a cool framework. That paid framework is an interesting framework to organize your thoughts. I'll just share one challenge that I've been working with some customers on recently, is step-up authentication. And in a lot of systems, particularly web systems, your initial authentication is really weak, right? It's based on signing up on the website and maybe sending an email back, right, to confirm your identity. So that's a weak level of authentication. But maybe in your system you want a little stronger identity before you allow someone to do transactions, like money transactions. So maybe you require a canceled check or some other stronger form of identity. In some of the financials I work with, there's higher levels of authentication depending on what channel you use to access the system. If you're on the intranet, then you're considered, you're in the building with a badge in a locked building, so you've got a higher identity. But if you're coming from outside the building, from the internet or from some other untrusted network, then you're considered to have sort of lower level of trust in your identity. So this notion of the confidence that you have in the identity and in the authentication of the person is really important. Some sites actually have like E-Trade. Before you execute a trade, you not only have to log in and maybe have a session with them, but you also have to provide your transaction password. So there's a special high assurance password that goes along with really sensitive transactions. That's to authenticate you a little better. And CAPTCHA fits into that framework as well, right? CAPTCHA is a way of proving that not only can you access the site, but also that you're not an automated tool. So considering those different levels of authentication is really important in your identity scheme.
Jeff, why are those CAPTCHA characters getting longer? It takes me 10 characters, 10 CAPTCHAs to get into LinkedIn now.
Yeah.
It used to be 4.
Well, so that's pretty simple, right? The bad guys are getting much better at writing tools that look like humans, and at some point they're going to surpass the ability to, you're going to have CAPTCHAs that are so difficult that humans can't do them, and only the tools can do them. So you've invented a reverse CAPTCHA, right? That's an arms race, and I actually think that it's kind of a dead end. Like, it's an evolutionary cycle that it has to die, because we're not going to be able to keep up, no matter how many tricks you do there. So I don't see that as a real good direction for the identity meta system to evolve to.
Right. I mean, I just want to add one observation to Jeff's comments. Insider and outsider, we kind of usually draw the implicit kind of boundary, and we say if they're within the firewall, then it's okay for us to be able to give more access. I think that's why that audit part of that whole paid framework comes into play, because insider can be equally disastrous to the organization. The enemy behind the firewall may be actually even more dangerous than the one outside, right? And so auditing becomes so crucial when it comes down to identity management. And also with regard to CAPTCHA, you guys may want to search up on something called PWNTCHA, PWNTCHA, pretending we are not humans or something like that. And it's actually the anti-CAPTCHA project to break CAPTCHA protection. So it's pretty cool, I think.
So that's interesting. I just wanted to add on to that, because I've been working with a number of financial organizations that traditionally they had managed their staff as their insiders, right? And they've got 15,000 employees or 100,000 employees, and they can manage that. But now all of a sudden with the web, they're like, hey, you know what? We need to manage the identities of our users. And so they might have insiders and then their account holders. So maybe they've got 100,000 account holders or 1 million account holders, but they're expanding that considerably further now. They want to have a touch point with every person, right? Ultimately, they want to have, they want you to come to their site and immediately create an account, because they want to have a relationship with you. And it starts with just a simple email address, registration. So now all of a sudden, instead of just managing a manageable number, they want 200 million accounts. Like, it gets really big, really fast. And managing all that is very, very difficult.
Hord? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add a thought while I was thinking about it. Access controls and managing access controls has been a problem for a long time. It's one that we really haven't solved. And once you see the breakdown of what it takes to actually manage it and to allow privileges, power users, your administrators, and you finally get through the difficult task of deciding who gets to go where and what role they play within the organization. And then you have to deal with your contractors and your insiders and the outsiders on that side of it. Then the real work starts, in my view, and that's the maintenance of all of it. And then making sure that that you don't just accept it as the status quo. I solved that problem, it's now somebody else's, because it changes the very next day. And I think someone mentioned when somebody leaves and comes back into the company and their identity is still within the system. That was one of my biggest problems, was making sure that people actually kept the access list updated and current. And then when users retired, died, left the company for whatever reason, then they were updated within the system. And having worked a long time in a profit-making company with Union Carbide, I've worked 27 years with the government, I consulted, and now working for a nonprofit. The differences between the way those different entities handle access and validate it's really huge. And we fault our government for a lot of things, but I have to say they are trying. They are at least trying to do that. And some of the companies I have dealt with, primarily the consulting end of it, are really behind the power curve when it comes to keeping up. And they put that price tag out front on everything that they add to authentication, software development, or even the proposals that they bring back for other entities.
So I'll just add on to that. I think it is important to think about access control universe as well, but I'm trying to focus here on the identity systems. You got to get identity solved before you can do access control, right? If you don't know who they are, then you can't figure out how to give them access. But one clear relationship is that the identity system is going to have to be different, managed by different people than the access control system, right? Because maybe the government conceivably could verify your identity, but they're not going to know exactly what role you have within Bank of America or wherever, right? Different management infrastructure.